So, welcome all. My name is Nikit Abhyankar. I'm the co-faculty director of the India Energy and Climate Center at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm also a faculty within the Goldman School of Public Policy of the University of California, Berkeley. Good morning, good evening from wherever you are. So, before we directly jump into this webinar, I want to leave you with one thought because that is really all of this is all of this webinar is about. Anywhere else in the world, industrial electrification is a cost that all the industries have to pay. But the economics is extremely compelling in case of India, irrespective of which industrial sector you're talking about, irrespective of which temperature range you're talking about, and irrespective of which end use you're talking about. And of course, it depends on, is it compelling compared to domestic coal? Is it compelling compared to domestic gas? Of course, those questions need to be assessed. But this is something that we are going to discuss in detail in this webinar. So before we jump into the actual webinar, let me quickly introduce our team here. This report and this study was done jointly by Energy Innovation, which is a think tank based in San Francisco, and the University of California, Berkeley's India Energy and Climate Center. Most of the work was led by Sonali Deshpande and Nick Sawe, who are going to walk us through this report and the analysis today. And it was also supported by Jeff Friesman of Energy Innovation. From the University of California, Berkeley side, it was supported by Jose Dominguez, Amol Fadke, who is the faculty director of the India Energy and Climate Center, and myself, Nikit Abhyankar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sonali to walk us through the study. Sonali and Nikit, take it away.
Thank you, Nikit. Yeah, let me share my screen. Okay. Yep, so we will be going over the findings from our report on electrifying industrial heat in India. Nikit already went over our team, but in case you would like to see our lovely pictures, here they are. So as Nikit mentioned, this report was a joint effort by Energy Innovation and UC Berkeley's India Energy and Climate Center. And it really was inspired by this immense opportunity for industrial electrification in India. For one, Indian industrial firms are increasingly being pushed off coal over air pollution concerns, but other fossil fuels like oil and natural gas must be imported, meaning they're expensive and subject to global supply chain volatility, which hurts energy security. But India doesn't need to face these two bad choices because record low solar prices offer a pathway out that is economic and pollution-free. So our report assesses the cost competitiveness of electrifying Indian industry using solar power or grid electricity. It estimates the relevant emissions and public health impacts, and it recommends key policies that can advance India's industrial transition. So let's provide some context on Indian industry before diving into the analysis. As one of the world's fastest developing economies, India has a very large and productive manufacturing sector, providing 17% of the country's GDP, nearly 20 million jobs, and $451 billion in exports. But at the same time, the sector's energy and emissions impact is huge. Industry accounts for nearly half of the country's final energy consumption, the vast majority being fossil fuels. In fact, industry is directly responsible for 23% of India's coal use, 17% of oil use, and nearly half of its gas use. And that heavy fossil fuel use comes with a huge emissions toll, 1.3 billion metric tons of CO2 emissions annually, nearly half of the country's total annual emissions. As you can see in this graph, iron and steel and chemicals are the two most energy-intensive industries, and along with two other heavy industries, non-metallic minerals and refining, they account for nearly 2/3 of India's industrial energy use. The challenge is that fossil fuels don't just emit greenhouse gases, but also local air pollution. And in fact, Indian industry is responsible for more particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions than India's entire transportation sector, which is massive. So lowering those emissions requires understanding where they come from. Most are from fossil fuels burned for heat and mechanical energy, as you can see in this blue box on the left. Industry also uses fossil fuels as feedstocks, which release CO2 when they're chemically transformed into products or when those products are used or discarded. And then there are also indirect emissions from industry's use of purchased electricity and heat produced offsite using fossil fuels. So these different emission sources need different solutions. For fossil fuels burned for energy, those processes can be electrified, which is emissions free if it's powered by renewable electricity. Fossil feedstocks can be replaced with clean feedstocks made from clean hydrogen, sustainable biomass, or recycled materials, and purchased electricity and heat can be replaced by clean electricity. But since these strategies can be expensive and resource intensive, the highest priority, it's important to mention, is to first reduce industrial energy demand through energy efficiency, material efficiency, and circular economy strategies. I'll also briefly mention that carbon capture and storage is another industrial decarbonization solution that has a role, but it should be reserved for just a very few specific use cases, and we'll mention that later. But largely electrification is the solution for industrial emissions. So why is industrial decarbonization important for India at all? We touched on this a bit earlier. Indian industry can't keep relying on imported fuels. Those fossil fuels are already very expensive in typical times, and global supply chain issues can send their prices soaring, like we've seen in the last few months with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz during the Iran war. But industry can't keep relying on coal either, especially in urban industrial zones that are feeding a severe air pollution-driven public health crisis. And importantly, India's reliance on fossil fuels is not compatible with the goal to reach net zero emissions by 2070, especially as industry is rapidly growing to meet the demands of industrialization. But fortunately, the perfect solution is available to Indian industry: cheap, clean solar power. As I mentioned earlier, India has some of the lowest solar prices in the world, with recent auctions clearing at 2.5 rupees per kilowatt hour for standalone solar and 3.6 rupees per kilowatt hour for solar plus battery storage. While electrification might raise prices in other regions of the world, that's not true in India if powered by cheap solar. And as this graph shows, solar deployment in India is skyrocketing due to these low costs, with India poised to surpass the US to become the world's largest solar market this year. Unfortunately, India's electric utilities can't keep up with this rapidly growing clean energy supply at the moment, and there are 42 gigawatts of competitive renewable projects currently looking for off-takers. So electrifying industry could be a huge solution in keeping this solar boom going. Unfortunately, policies exist to help Indian industry access that abundant, cheap solar. India's green energy open access rules allow loads of at least 100 kilowatts to directly access renewables via third-party power purchase agreements or off-site captive power plants where they use grid infrastructure to wheel the energy to the factory. Obtaining captive solar entails a small wheeling fee, but it avoids most grid surcharges, keeping costs low. There are a few eligibility requirements as listed here. Smaller manufacturers can also benefit from this open access policy by aggregating with other loads. And India recently clarified and streamlined these rules, created a single window digital portal for participating firms and expanded the renewable energy available to firms by granting them access to interstate transmission lines. So this is a huge opportunity for taking advantage of that low-cost solar. So now I'll pass it to Nick to explore the opportunity for electrification in a little more detail.
Thanks, Sonali. So yes, we'll be looking at the potentials of the technologies, economics, and the impacts of switching India's industry over to electrification. Next slide. And really, we have to tend to industrial process heat. Now, globally, that accounts for the vast majority, 84% of industry's non-feedstock fossil fuel use. And that process heat needs to be supported across a range of temperatures. In India, there are very high temperature needs concentrated in its burgeoning iron and steel industry, as well as non-metallic metals or cement. And the strong chemicals industry has a lot of need in the medium and high temperatures as well. Next slide. Fortunately, we have electric technologies currently that can provide heat across all the temperatures that we use in industry, whether that's induction heating or electric arc furnaces, or as we're going to be hearing a lot more about today, industrial heat pumps at temperatures under 200 Celsius, and then thermal batteries as well that provide storage capacity. Next slide. The price proposition for India is also very suitable right now. On-site solar, whether that's paired with storage or not, as well as captive solar, are cheaper than oil and natural gas. And grid electricity as well could be cheaper currently. It has cross subsidies where industrial customers are supporting agricultural and residential customers, but that price would come down considerably if this was not the case. Next slide. We also have to keep in mind, as we're comparing across different energy sources, that fossil fuel efficiency really is not up to snuff compared to electricity and declines with increasing temperature. So energy is lost in exhaust gas as sensible and latent heat. And at high temperatures, this can lead to as little as 21% efficiency. Now, waste heat recovery can reduce that heat loss by 1/3 to 2/3, but electrified heating circumvents that entirely as it doesn't produce combustion exhaust gas. So that avoids these energy losses and dramatically improves the cost proposition of electrification versus fossil fuels at high temperatures. Next slide. So we're going to break down our techno-economic analysis in a moment. And what we looked at when we were modeling different industrial heating configurations included heat pumps and electric resistance boilers and furnaces using 3 different electricity sources. So on-site solar and battery storage, captive solar and battery storage, and then grid electricity, and then thermal batteries that use on-site solar. And those were compared to biomass, coal, petroleum, and natural gas-fired boilers and furnaces. And we broke them down across all the temperature ranges that we just saw a moment ago. We did a levelized cost of heat calculation, and that included energy costs and capital costs amortized over 26 years with an 11% discount rate, as well as carbon costs of $10 US per ton of CO2 emissions. We adjusted for equipment efficiency as well. So electricity, as we see here, is cheaper than petroleum and gas for industrial heating across all the temperature ranges, considerably so. And we can see on the next slide as well that there are temperature ranges as well that account for over half of India's industrial heat demand, where electricity is even cheaper than coal. So that's 200 Celsius or less, that's supported by heat pumps, as well as those high temperatures of 1,000 Celsius or more. And we are very close to cost parity as well for using thermal batteries at 500 Celsius onwards. So really it's that medium temperature, 200 to 500 Celsius window where coal is still outperforming the electricity options. So that efficiency gain over coal is really in the low end, driven by the unparalleled efficiency of electric heat pumps. So they can deliver 3 to 4 times as much heat as the electricity that they consume for temperature increases of 30 to 80 Celsius. And they're still the most efficient technology that we have out there when delivering larger temperature increases like 150 Celsius. Now, at these higher temperatures, fossil fuel efficiency plummets, as we just saw, even with waste heat recovery. And so in those cases, electric furnaces and thermal batteries still are maintaining 95+% efficiency and really stand out by the comparison. Next slide. In India, already there have been pilots up to 140 Celsius industrial heat pumps. Current models cap out roughly around that. There have been some models that go up to 165 that are a bit harder to get. And then there are newer models outcoming that supports temperatures up to 200 Celsius. In India, heat pumps have been piloted in places like chocolate and sugar plantations, as well as a Gujarat chemical manufacturing plant, where it cut energy usage by 38% and achieved ROI in 18 months. Next slide. For those mid and high temperature ranges, thermal batteries essentially work by taking either electricity from the grid or from off-grid solar and wind, and then running it through an electric resistance heater in a thermal storage medium. And oftentimes, this is a very inexpensive medium like graphite blocks, bricks, that kind of thing. And the hot gas is then used in an industrial process or heat exchanger. Less commonly, heat can also be extracted by opening shutters to let out visible and infrared light. Next slide. So thermal batteries have a couple of different options to cut costs. They can use on-site solar, including without battery storage. They can also arbitrage pricing with time-varying electricity rates. And so industrial customers in India frequently have a 15 to 20% surcharge for peak use and 15 to 20% discount during solar hour or off-peak times, right? So in Uttar Pradesh, that's plus minus 15%, and in Delhi, that's a plus minus 20. And then you end up with these large price swings around the baseline cost that the thermal batteries can translate into an opportunity. Next slide. And thermal storage pilots have already been performed in India at a Tata Steel plant in Jharkhand using Craft Block's thermal battery. That's 20 megawatts of storage for waste heat up to 500 Celsius. And then they reuse that in the sinter process. And that just started operation last year. Next slide. In the US and EU, they're starting to scale thermal storage pilots. So one big example is on Antora Energy's project in South Dakota, using a 5,000 megawatt hour battery array at an ethanol refinery. And that just started operation this year, 2026. Next slide. And electrification can really cut down on industrial greenhouse gas emissions, essentially cutting them in half. And so we can see here, we used modeling from our industrial technology transformation and investment model that supports numerous countries in, especially in East Asia, which we just put out a recent World Bank report with, but also India. And you can use that to break down not just emissions, but also energy costs of different interventions to decarbonize Indian industry, as well as take a look at the impacts of that in terms of capital expenditures, emissions, public health impacts, that sort of thing. So we see both easy and other higher temperature electrification essentially offsetting over 900 million metric tons of CO2 every year. Now, we also note that there are considerable emissions reductions to be gained from CCS and green hydrogen, but in both cases, we advocate using those only in very specific use cases and doing electrification when it's appropriate. So for hydrogen, some of the good use cases are primary steel making with H2DRI, chemical feedstocks production for ammonia, methanol, olefins, aromatics, using it in refineries. And then for CCS, using that for very difficult to abate non-energy CO2, for example, from cement making and certain chemical transformations, as well as bioenergy CO2 from truly low carbon sources, and addressing 90% or more purity CO2 streams from ammonia production, ethanol fermentation, those kinds of applications, as well as the production of blue hydrogen from refinery byproducts or to displace gray hydrogen. Okay, next slide. And not just CO2 emissions are abated, but electrification really slashes conventional pollutants as well. So, renewable-backed technologies, electric technologies really don't produce any conventional air pollution. But you can see on the right that we're comparing when we say something like heat pump with the grid. These are emissions from that heat pumping plugged into grid with the present day distribution of resources, energy sources. And so even then, grid-connected heat pumps emit a quarter to half of the particulate matter and SO2 of electric resistance equipment. And particulate matter is highest, of course, from coal and biomass sources, and then lowest from petroleum and gas. Coal-fired technologies are second to grid-powered electric resistance equipment in sulfur dioxide and NOx emissions. But gas-fired equipment also produces similar NOx emissions to coal at high temperatures, so over 1,000 Celsius. Those air pollution benefits that we can get from direct electrification can have a big impact on lives saved. So could be almost 800,000 lives per year in India when we're doing business as usual forecasts rolled out to 2070. Also prevents a number of non-lethal health impacts like heart attacks, lung cancer cases, and strokes. And so really great benefit to the quality of life of everyone around them. And I'm going to hand it back to Sonali now to talk about policies that we can use to help fuel industrial electrification.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So yeah, despite the immense potential benefits of industrial electrification that Nick talked about, industrial electrification lags in all around the world, including in India, and a few key policies can help to kickstart it. This is just a broad overview of the types of policies that we generally recommend to encourage industrial electrification. The point of this slide is to show that it's not really one policy, but a suite of policies that is needed to work together and advance these important solutions. So, as our analysis showed, cheap solar and storage are largely what make industrial electrification competitive in India today. So, one category of policies that are important for expanding industrial electrification are policies that expand industries' access to solar. One way that India can do this is by further streamlining their green energy open access rules in a few ways. India can extend the current waiver on transmission charges so that firms can access abundant solar power in other states, expanding the eligibility criteria to more firms, and standardizing state-level provisions as well as charges and settlement periods. India can also consider industrial electrification in energy system planning, for example, to help co-locate solar or solar parks with electrified industry, which not only expands solar access, but also can reduce cost adders for energy. Another step is to improve the competitiveness of grid-based electrification, is to lower the cost of grid power. And this can help firms that face more barriers to directly accessing solar power. The best way to lower grid electricity costs, basically anywhere in the world, is to deploy more clean energy, which produces zero or even negative cost energy at times of day when renewables are abundant. As you can see in the map of wholesale electricity prices in the US on the right, prices are lowest in the middle of the country where renewable energy penetration, particularly wind energy, is highest. So increasing renewables deployment in India requires addressing some of the largest barriers to continued renewables deployment today, citing transmission and clean energy component availability. India can help to site renewables by streamlining the classification of sites and expanding solar parks, and state governments can also get more involved in land acquisition and aggregation for clean energy. For transmission, Advanced conductors and grid enhancing technologies can optimize existing transmission capacity, and India could also leverage coal plants' transmission capacity to use for renewables. And to make more clean energy components available, there are various tools at the government's disposal, like domestic manufacturing incentives and investment in research and development. Beyond all those options, investing in grid-scale battery storage can enable more renewables deployment by balancing its intermittent supply. And then finally, a more direct way to reduce industrial electricity rates in India is to remove electricity cross subsidies, which Nick mentioned earlier. And while this is already a policy priority in India, it does face some implementation challenges, for example, due to the financial health issues of many electric distribution companies in India. So yeah, that's a policy that will require a variety of reforms. Financial incentives can bridge the cost gap where industrial electrification is still not yet cost competitive, but it's close, like for medium temperature heating, like we talked about. They include targeted incentives that help to that directly subsidize clean production. So this can include production-linked incentives for clean commodities, where firms are rewarded for producing commodities with lower embodied emissions. It can be incentives for the capital costs of clean industrial equipment. And green public procurement can, in which the government purchases low carbon materials, can boost demand for low carbon products and therefore indirectly subsidize clean production. Those should be paired ideally with financing tools that help firms cover the upfront costs of clean equipment. While over the lifetime of clean industrial equipment, it has a payback usually in India. Those upfront costs can be challenging for firms to cover, especially for smaller firms. So there are various tools like credit enhancement mechanisms, as well as low-cost long-term loans that can be distributed by a green bank or a government agency or both. Another thing India can do is to end fossil fuel subsidies, which artificially deflate the price of fossil fuels. And carbon pricing plus a carbon border adjustment can also raise the price of fossil fuels to fairly reflect its social costs, while the border adjustment protects domestic firms from competition from foreign firms that don't face the same carbon price. And then finally, there are a variety of enabling policies that can address the non-financial barriers to industrial electrification. So for one, India is establishing a cap and trade policy that puts carbon intensity standards on industrial facilities across 9 subsectors. So that is a type of emissions standard in addition to a carbon price. Another type of standard they could introduce is a clean heat obligation, which would require a certain share of a facility's industrial process heat to be zero emissions heat. Emissions disclosure and labeling can help increase demand for low carbon products. Research and development, as well as demonstration support, can help to commercialize early stage industrial electrification technologies, like for high temperature thermal batteries, for example. Domestic manufacturing incentives can help to make those technologies more available in India, and then talent policies like workforce training and immigration policy can help to bolster the skilled workforce that India needs for industrial electrification. And finally, I'll just drive home this point that no single policy can advance industrial electrification on its own. It's important to spread the weight of industrial decarbonization across multiple policy types, which each have their own upsides and drawbacks. Relying too much on financial incentives means the government is paying a lot for advancing industrial electrification, and that might just not be feasible from a budgetary perspective. Relying too much on technological advancement, like cost declines through innovation, is risky and uncertain because you don't know what that innovation will yield necessarily and when it will yield that. And then relying too much on standards and carbon pricing while those policies are important, if you rely too much on them, then the market can bear too much of the cost of industrial electrification, particularly the capital costs, and those could lead to higher prices for consumers or other challenges. And that's it. I'll pass it back to Nikit now.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Sonali, and thanks a lot, Nick, for the wonderful presentation. So we have lots of questions, and we have plenty of time for taking those questions and having a rich discussion. So if you have not done so, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. I would urge you not to post them in the regular chat. So if you post it in Q&A, it will be easier for us to answer and track and manage those questions. Thanks a lot. So we're going to take those questions one by one. So first, we have a question from Anjana. And does the 3.6 rupees include all incentives and subsidies provided by the government right now? And what would happen if the subsidies or those incentives are taken away? I'll be happy to take the first crack at that question, Anjana. I think the 3.6 rupees per kilowatt hour, it really that is basically the price of solar, including some grid, open access grid and network charges. So it does not really include any incentives for that matter. For example, it does not include any banking incentives. It does not include any transmission cost waivers and so on and so forth. And that's a 2030 projection for how much the price could be if utilized at the high transmission capacity factor. So we'll move on to the next one. We have a question from Abhinav, and I think that's a very good question. Abhinav, is bulk of I mean, the medium and small and medium scale industries are really the backbone of Indian industry. Unlike large firms, MSMEs really lack access to capital and technology and best practices. So any kind of policy prescription we do really needs to take this into account. And Sonali, I think you addressed partly in your policy options slide. So can you speak a bit more on what specifically would you recommend, especially for small and medium scale enterprises?
Yeah, sure thing. So I did mention that with the open access rules, the recent updates did grant smaller firms more access to those rules. For example, if they aggregate with other small loads, they can qualify for direct access to solar power. But that can be expanded even further. You know, they could reduce the size requirement of the load below 100 kilowatts. India also has, some existing industrial equipment modernization incentives that are specifically targeted at MSMEs. So expanding those existing incentive policies to low carbon equipment specifically can help those firms. And then I would say technical assistance is probably would be a huge help for these smaller firms that might lack, awareness of what these new equipment are, how to install them, how to operate them. If you can have that expertise at the government level available to help industrial firms that need it, I think that could be really instrumental.
Yeah, Abhinav, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, Nikit. And I wanted to also congratulate the team, Sonali and Nick, for a fabulous presentation, a much needed one. And as I think Sonali said rightly, in the wake of this turmoil, this has further accentuated the crisis. And my question actually, I'm writing a piece that is going to come out tomorrow. The idea is MSMEs are not just the most vulnerable. They are also the ones which will probably not be able to recover. And these strategies which probably are applicable to state-owned enterprises, some of which I think some of you have talked about, and bigger firms which have access to capital, technology, processes. MSMEs don't have it. And Indian context, they are the ones which actually not only bear the brunt, but to some extent are dispersed in every nook and corner of country. So I think we need to go a bit granular, not only in terms of our methodologies, but also how do we adopt some of that at scale. So I think some bit of nuance as far as that is concerned would be helpful, even at research, not just engagement, even at research. So a few thoughts maybe from you on those lines would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I could envision, especially for the medium businesses, if we design better incentives for supporting like, heat pump adoption, right? Especially for something that's like a food and beverage industry or another industry that has enough of that low temperature heat demand. You know, you might be able to capture enough of the medium enterprises that could still benefit from that. I think for very small mom and pop shops, then it is very tricky to find how do we electrify, and that might be very basic stuff like you electrifying the motors as opposed to trying to do all the process heating, right? And there's a lot of low hanging fruit on the table also to take advantage of. So that's an encouraging thing as well.
And I think, Abhinav, one of the things that I truly believe India is uniquely positioned is because, see, the thing is, if you look at, let's say, US, the cost of natural gas is $3 per MMBTU. So any competition with industrial heating becomes extremely hard at $3 per MMBTU gas price. But that's not the case in India. The gas price is very high. So economic case already is very compelling to begin with. In Europe, the gas price is very high, but the electricity price is also very high. So again, the economic case kind of becomes very hard. In India, even that is not true. The clean electricity price is record low, open access, captive procurement. So I believe a large chunk of it will also have to do, especially for MSMEs, is making sure they can access clean electricity at the lowest cost possible. And that can take the form of either creating some clean power platforms or making sure that discoms don't really oppose, because discoms are going to fight tooth and nail because they are their
Exactly.
paying customers. So they
They
don't
are
want
the
them to
actually,
go away.
yeah, yeah.
So just making, so it's really an ecosystem question than just creating a specific financial incentive for a specific MSME. I don't think that is what is going to drive the change. But I think this is a very rich topic, and there's a lot of research that needs to happen precisely around this, because 31% of India's manufacturing GDP gets created in the MSME sector. MSME sector is the second largest employment sector after agriculture in India. So this is an extremely crucial sector for industrial transformation as well as for economic transformation in India.
And if I can add very quickly, I'll take only half a minute. I mean, large firms, they would find it easier to transition, would find easier to decarbonize, right? While we might just face a situation where we would see a chunk of Indian industries, at least in number, and as Nikhit said, also in volumes, would end up remaining the other side of the tunnel, which would actually render the entire process infructuous. So we need to kind of take everyone along in this decarbonization journey. Stop here. Thank
Absolutely.
you for this wonderful conversation. Look forward to this fructifying in the long term.
Absolutely. Thanks, Abhinav. So just in the interest of time, we're quickly going to move on to the next one. We have Siddharth Sahu. So Siddharth asks, how does the overall decarbonization potential of heat compare to CCS or hydrogen fuel stock substitution, or even energy efficiency or material substitution? So Sonali, Nick, who would you like to take this? How about Nick?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of how does it measure up in terms of potential for emissions reduction? So we had shown a little bit of the emissions from our industrial technology transformation and investment model, and there, material efficiency and energy efficiency strategies ends up being the largest mover. It does exceed easy electrification, which we classify as things that can be covered by heat pumps, 200 C or underneath, although it's still less potential than tackling all of electrification of industrial heat. CCS and green hydrogen emissions reductions probably comparable. They're a little bit higher than tackling the other electrifications above 200 Celsius in terms of emissions reductions. The nice thing about the low temperature electrification and then also materials and energy efficiency strategies is that, and you can download the model for yourselves and play around with it. In terms of the financial expenditures, those end up actually being cost-saving mechanisms, right? Whereas CCS, green hydrogen, that cost investment per ton can be a lot more considerable. But it's not just a cost consideration that we think of when we're thinking about when is it appropriate to use electrification. We're really thinking about, for example, for green hydrogen, if you are essentially using it to substitute for something you otherwise could use electricity for, because of you're essentially building it with clean electricity and then converting it back into electricity, and so you end up oftentimes triple paying for the electricity in terms of the energy use and the efficiency. So have to weigh and balance all this stuff, and a lot of times green hydrogen, for instance, is much better served as using it for molecules and not for electricity equivalent, and getting it in there as a feedstock.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Nick. Siddharth also has the next question. What regions or states would have the greatest potential for industrial heat electrification? So I can take that on. Siddharth, it really depends on which end users you're looking at. And given that industries are very well spread out across the country, so it's hard to put down one specific state. It would be in clusters, though. For example, for textile cluster in Gujarat, there's some in Maharashtra. The potential would be very high, especially for heat pumps. There is glass and ceramics clusters, again, some in Gujarat, some in Uttar Pradesh, again, very high potential. There are pharma clusters and so on. So they're truly spread out. It's hard to put that number. So would you like to add a quick comment to your previous question on this? Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Then we move on to Srinivas, and Srinivas asks, did we analyze any grid infrastructure upgrades to support industrial electrification at scale? So the short answer, Srinivas, is no, we did not, because the objective of this study was just to set the high-level potential and assess, is there a technical and economic case for different sets of temperature and end users and industries in India. But that is definitely one aspect that we do expect to explore further in the coming months and coming years. Overall, distribution upgradation is going to be absolutely crucial for not just for industrial electrification, but also for increasing use in the residential customers, electric vehicles, charging stations, and so on and so forth. So that's our new an upcoming area of work for sure.
Yeah, and also on the energy innovation side, we recently released like a Overcoming All Barriers to Industrial Electrification report, and that is general, but we do have some breakouts for specific regions like India, but that does walk through what do we need to think about in terms of upgrading the grid if we're going to serve this properly. But yeah, we don't have specific analyses for India yet, which would be great to do, and we can get on that.
All right, thanks a lot. So we're just going to limit, unfortunately, one question per participant for now, and if we have time, we can come back to others. So Srinivas, your next questions, we'll come back to them in the end. Okay. So we have a question from Anonymous. Are there any pilot projects that maybe Sonali or Nick you could talk about, especially for high temperature heat pumps? Has this been deployed anywhere? And then what does the performance look like, if you know?
Yeah, I do believe that high temperature heat pumps are starting to be deployed in India. As Nick mentioned, there are over 100 heat pump projects that we're aware of. One company that comes to mind is Trigen DC. I think they produce heat pumps, I believe, up to 165 Celsius, maybe higher. And they're already deploying in a lot of different industries. And there are many other companies out there as well. These are heat pumps that are being manufactured in India and are available in India to firms today. So yeah, the short answer is yes, I think.
Excellent. So, is there a resource that you could recommend where people can find information of uh, where it has been deployed or any pilot projects?
We have a few examples listed in our report. Yeah, I'm not aware of any other central resource, but that would be great for someone to put together.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Then we move on to Srihari. How much of the technology, heat pumps, thermal batteries, and related know-how and the ecosystem exists in India? And is there any role for technology transfer from other countries to India? I think that's an excellent question, Srihari. There is good news and a bad news here, right? Good news is that, yeah, technology exists. I mean, first of all, heat pumps, including industrial heat pumps, is a pretty global, commercially available technology. There is no rocket science there. In fact, there are many Indian companies as well that are actively deploying heat pumps in certain industries, especially there are a few startups that are coming out of IIT Madras, IIT Chennai, and they are deploying some heat pumps in the textile clusters, particularly Bhiwandi in Maharashtra. They're also exploring some textile clusters in Surat. They are also deploying heat pumps in some pharma clusters. Uh, Thermal batteries also. Uh, uh, so the coils that are inserted within those refractory bricks in thermal batteries are actually manufactured in India. They're sourced from India by European and American companies and installed in the US and in Europe. So this technology and also refractory bricks per se is not a foreign technology for India. Many cement plants already use refractory bricks. So at the technology level, it does exist. The ecosystem, of course, it does not. And that depends on a lot of factors. But I believe that's where some of the policy solutions that Sonali talked about, creating some of those first projects, creating pilot projects, financing, they become really crucial. Would you like to add anything, Sonali, Nick, Srihari, and any reflections?
No, thanks. That helps a lot. Thanks a lot, Nikit. Yeah, no questions.
Excellent, thanks. Then we have questions from Aditya. Are there enough technologies available for low temperature heat electrification, especially in terms of heat pumps and waste heat recovery? Because most of the high temperature heat, like steel or cement, and how can MSMEs actually trust these technologies, given that there is significant capex? So Sonali, Nick, would you like to take this?
Yeah. Thinking back to the slides, right? We had a whole range of electrified technologies that can cover different heating ranges. And if you think back to the lower temperature end of that, that's electric resistance, it's induction heating, dielectric heating, infrared heating. A lot of these things not alien to something like the food and beverage industry or textiles or whatnot. And so it doesn't always have to be just heat pumps, although it would be good to get financial assistance for people to be able to get over that capex hurdle for something like heat pumps. But really, because India's renewables are so cheap, getting onto these more efficient electrified technologies instead of fossil fuel combustion really does make sense as a cost proposition, regardless of what kind of electrified technology that you're using for that low end. It's just that heat pumps have that really outsized, sometimes 3 to 4x efficiency over an electric resistance heater at converting that electricity into usable process heat. So ideally, we make the transition onto heat pumps as much as possible, but also there are a number of options that maybe are less capex intensive, but still offer some of the benefits of getting onto clean sources of electricity.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. So I'm sorry we got to move on. We won't be able to spend a lot of time on each question. So the next two questions I'm going to combine from Mahesh and Vinay. Great to see you, Mahesh, by the way. So I think both questions relate to there would be some factory level upgrades that may be needed when you switch from a steam-based heating to either electric boilers or even heat pump based heating, both in terms of electrical infrastructure as well as with piping and plumbing and some other factory level upgrades. So how do those costs compare? And have we considered those in our economic analysis, Sonali and Nick?
Yeah, sure. So we did account for the capital costs of the electric equipment, of all the industrial equipment in our analysis. Generally, capital costs of industrial equipment are much lower than operating costs over the lifetime of the equipment. Obviously, if the operating costs are lower, then the capital costs are going to take up a higher proportion. And I think for heat pumps specifically, the capital costs are a higher portion of the lifetime cost compared to other equipment. And they can have some challenges like larger floor space requirements, whereas electric boilers are more of a one-to-one replacement for combustion boilers. But yeah, we did take into account the capital costs, not the relevant facility upgrade costs, because that data is just harder to find. But it shouldn't make too much of a difference. As you can, if you have taken a look at some of the levelized cost of heat graphs that we've included in the report, it shows the breakdown of the levelized cost of heat by energy cost, annualized capital cost, as well as carbon cost, which is very small. And so you can see that energy cost is generally making up the largest portion.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. So we're going to move on, but I think Mahesh and Vinay, the points are pretty well taken. There would be some infrastructure level upgrades that may be needed, and those would be quite specific to industries and end users. And that is again the next frontier of the research is actually assessing those specific upgrades that may be needed for specific clusters for specific end users. But we'll be happy to have follow-up conversations with you on that topic. So moving on, we have the next question. By the way, can I ask Sonali or Nick to just stop sharing the screen?
Oh, yeah.
So the next question is from Steve, is for the mid-range heat, the best option in our analysis is solar plus storage powered by heat pumps. But there is some new solar thermal technologies that have significantly achieved lower costs, and that could be interesting. But we have not considered them in our analysis in our report. But Sonali or Nick, have you looked at solar thermal based heating in your analysis elsewhere, and what are your thoughts?
I have not particularly. Our colleague, who is also a co-author on the report, Jeff Rissman, he wrote a book called Zero Carbon Industry, which covers a lot of industrial decarb technologies, and he covers solar thermal a little bit in his book, but it's generally not a technology that we prioritize.
Right. But Steve, we would be more than happy to receive any material that you might have, and happy to look at this. Okay, moving on. I think Aditya, we already took one of your questions, so I'm going to move on to Charulata. How easy it is to transition transition to industrial electrification from existing systems. And I think, can you comment on the initial investments? I think we have partly answered this, Charulata, so I'm going to move on just in the interest of time. Aniruddha writes that MSMEs are spread out, and so electrification in clusters and innovative policies could be thought of. 100% agree with you, Aniruddha. Especially MSMEs are just so heterogeneous. So one size fits all style policies or programs are not going to work, especially for MSMEs. So one really needs to think cluster level, and one really needs to consider the local realities. For example, if the local distribution utility doesn't want to give that MSME cluster open access, it's not going to happen. So you have to take local distribution utilities along as well, along with some grid infrastructure upgrades and facility level upgrades. Point very well taken. So Sheshadri asks, does pricing include balancing cost of RE intermittency? In a way, yes, Sheshadri, because especially when we talk of thermal storage, we are effectively talking about absorbing all that daytime solar peak and storing that daytime excess solar energy into the batteries. So in a way it does. But if you're talking about the sub-hourly intermittency, and especially if you're injecting solar in Rajasthan, drawing it in Maharashtra or in Karnataka, and then what happens to those additional grid costs introduced by solar intermittency onto the grid, then no, specifically this analysis, we have not included those costs, but because we have stuck to what the current policy is. But we have addressed, we have accounted for, we have estimated what those costs are in our other analysis, and we'll be happy to share that with you later if you follow up with us. All right. So Rohan asks, how will the electrification tackle high temperature and pressure heat requirements? Current heat pump technology is not mature enough to match the output of a conventional thermal boiler. And the COP, the efficiency drops significantly at high temperature ranges. So should we consider a mix of electric boilers and heat pumps? Nick, Sonali?
Yeah, that might end up being the best course. I mean, we do a little bit of coverage in the report on kind of the pressure aspect of heat pumps and the types of arrangements you can get to get higher pressure. But yeah, I agree that it does cap out, and then also especially within India, that higher end that we're talking about, like 200 Celsius heat pumps is not as common, right? So definitely a role for both.
Excellent. Well, I think there's just one last question, and this will be the last one by anonymous participant. What could be the potential for storing energy in chemical bonds for a range of temperatures? I have not looked at that at all. So Sonali, Nick, it's 100% your domain.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a couple thermal storage technologies in the US that we're aware of that do this. So instead of storing heat as heat in hot materials, they will store heat essentially in chemical reactions. So there's one company called, I believe, Cache Energy, where they're essentially using limestone pellets that store energy, and when water is applied to those pellets, they release heat. And there are a couple interesting things about this technology. For one, it's very sort of flexible and modular. The pellets can be transported very easily from one facility to another without having to transport the entire battery as one. I believe it's something that can plug easily into existing industrial facilities. And the nice thing with chemical storage is that the duration is typically much longer than it would be for hot materials. Hot materials store energy for multiple hours or even multiple days, but some of these chemical storage options can offer seasonal storage, and that can be really useful in some regions, or given that, you know, renewable resources are they don't just vary throughout the day, but also seasonally. But yeah, this is still an emerging technology, and so we're still waiting to see more pilots to see how it fares. And I believe the temperature outputs that I've seen for these technologies are around up to 500 C, so kind of on par with the commercial models of other thermal batteries that we've seen.
Yeah,
Excellent.
there is a lot.
Yeah, sorry, Nick, but I think just in the interest of
no worries.
time, but thanks a lot, everybody, for joining this webinar and for such amazing set of questions and for your patience. And thanks a lot, Nick and Sonali, for an incredibly insightful presentation. And thanks a lot, Fernando, for organizing this webinar and then wading through the Zoom issues. So once again, we are very grateful for your support from the India Energy and Climate Center, as well as from Energy Innovation. Electrifying, goodbye. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.